First of all, I would like to welcome you all here to Jan's Steps. And on behalf of UCLA Campus Events, my name is Diane Gordon. I'm the Assistant Speakers Program Director and the Associated Student Speakers Program. We are very honored to co-sponsor this event with the Black Student Alliance today. And to introduce our very special guest, I would like to introduce Ms. Makani Temba, the chair of the Black Student Alliance.
Okay. Before I introduce Mr. Bond, I want to make a couple of brief announcements. One, South African Task Force meeting Thursday at 5, and that BSA is showing the film The Spook Who Sat by the Door Thursday, 7 o'clock, Dodd 121. Okay. Thanks for your patience. Our special guest today has been one of the good politicians, one of the black leadership whose tutelage took place in the grassroots movement of SNCC and Dr. King. Therefore, he has a degree of compassion and principle among legislators and leaders, black or white, that many don't have. And with this, it's our great pleasure to present to you Mr. Julian Bond.
Thank you a great deal for that kind introduction and warm welcome. It is a pleasure to be introduced as a politician because that is my profession. I know it's not the most popular profession to be in 1982. I'm sorry that it's not held in high repute because, as you know, it is a very important profession. It's the people who do what I do who decide whether or not you will do what you do. It's a relatively ancient profession. There are many who believe it to be the world's second oldest profession. But nonetheless, I'm just proud to know that I belong to the finest body of men that money can buy. We are a week or two away from the occasion in the United States when the people begin to decide what the course of the country and the country's influence on the rest of the world will be. That is an important decision-making time for all of us. It is particularly so in the fall of 1982, because for the past 20 months, we've lived in the United States under an administration run by an amiable incompetent, the architect of avarice as social policy. Now, when he took office almost 2 years ago, a great many of us were fearful. Today, I think we know what real fear is. Then we thought our civil rights might be in some jeopardy. Today, we see them swiftly slipping away. Then Reaganomics was an unproved economic theory. Today, Reaganomics is an unproved economic theory, but its application threatens to make the Depression resemble a Sunday school picnic. The whole northeastern tier of states in the United States is now in its worst depression in 50 years. Plants are closed almost daily. Shifts are laid off. 88% of black youth are jobless in Gary, Indiana. 83% in Riverside, California. 80% in Youngstown, Ohio. 79% in Montgomery, Alabama. By the middle of this summer, 100,000 young people in New York City had become what the Department of Labor euphemistically calls discouraged workers, had abandoned the search for jobs in a society which has abandoned them. 10% of the national workforce is idle. 30% of our manufacturing capacity is at rest. 57 cents of every federal tax dollar is committed to military expenses. 2/3 of the interest payments on the national debt are related to war. And through all this, we've lived under a government which oddly opposes abortion, yet supports the death penalty, apparently believing that life begins at conception and ends at birth. They intend, if we let them, to rearrange the United States to fit their sterile vision, to force conformity with their small minds and smaller dreams, riding the crest of a wave of antagonism against those Americans who cannot do for themselves. They intend to impose an awful austerity on us all. Now, this conservative confederacy has several aims. It intends to take the federal government entirely out of the business of enforcing equal opportunity. They intend, if we let them, to eliminate affirmative action for minorities and for women. They intend, in fact, to erase the laws and programs written in blood and sweat. In the 20 years since Martin King was the premier figure in black America, and black Americans seem single-minded in pursuit of our freedom. Now, the voters of the United States, that 26% of the electorate which provided the mandate under which this government rules, did much more on the 4th day of November 1980 than simply change the name of the occupant of the Oval Office, the face and the photograph on the post office wall. They began then the process of the national nullification of the needs of the needy, the gratuitous gratification of the gross and the greedy, and ushered in the politics of penuriousness, prevarication, impropriety, pious platitudes, and, dare I say it, self-righteous swinishness. They began then the process of marching the United States backward into the 18th century and surrendered our foreign policy to those who believe that all national struggles for self-determination are born in Moscow and that nuclear war is a viable option. Both at home and abroad, they've surrendered the general good to the corporate will. They intend to radically alter the relationship between America and Africa, to substitute mineral rights for human rights, and have already begun to embrace and endorse the most horrific government on the face of the planet Earth. Their favored allies and models in the world community are clients and tyrants. They prefer the hardware of war to the handiworks of peace. They are the first American government in 2 decades to use food as a weapon, to add starvation to the American arsenal. Their ambassador to the United Nations is a woman who sees people she doesn't know and then denies that she's seen them. The former Secretary of State is a man who, when in the Nixon administration, used to pound on the table with his palms like tom-toms when African affairs were discussed. The former Deputy Secretary of State is a man who admits he does not know the names of the heads of state of our enemies or our allies. They support workers' movements in Warsaw and crush them in Washington. They intend, in fact, if we let them, to use the power of government to further consolidate wealth in the minority of our population, to redistribute income in the United States from the bottom to the top, to undermine the Bill of Rights, to reintroduce Big Brother to the American scene. They have already begun an aggressive and near successful campaign to dismantle the civil rights protections written into statute and case law in the last 25 years. They intend, in fact, to turn back the civil rights clock until it becomes a sundial. For example, the White House inserted itself into school desegregation litigation in Louisiana and in Missouri, the latter action at the urging of that state's governor, Christopher Bond, no relation that we know. The Department of Justice, at the request of Senator Jeremiah Denton, removed the words white supremacy from a lawsuit against white supremacy in Mobile, Alabama. After House Republican Whip Trent Lott of Mississippi objected to a suit against jail conditions in his state, the Attorney General announced that no longer would justice bring such suits. In school integration cases in Seattle and in Chicago, the Department of Justice switched sides, in both cases reversing positions taken by its Republican and Democratic predecessors and supporting school plans which will reinforce segregated schools. With increasing frequency and stridency, the Attorney General has attacked the federal courts for protecting the rights of minorities. The Assistant Attorney General has declared that the Weber case, which supports voluntary affirmative action, was wrongly decided. The Attorney General has said that children who don't want to attend integrated schools will not be required to do so. 24 hours before a voting discrimination case involving Senator Strom Thurmond's hometown was to be heard, the Justice Department switched sides. In civil rights generally, a retreat has been sounded. The government's forces leading the way toward the dismal, distant past. It is here their actions are most frightful, their purposes most sinister, their design a deliberate attempt to restore white skin privilege and white male dominance in American life. The new chief of the Civil Rights Division of Justice has announced that no longer will the government require a discriminatory employer to promise to do wrong no more. Vice President Bush has just concluded a review of the guidelines designed to protect women from sexual harassment on the job and discrimination in college athletics. The Secretary of Labor has proposed new rules which will exempt 75% of the labor force from civil rights protections. He's ordered rescinding a Carter-era prohibition against federal contractors purchasing memberships in discriminatory private clubs for their employees. Under enormous pressure from the corporate community, the administration proposes to let the market system regulate full and fair employment for minorities and for women. The last time the market system guaranteed full employment for American black people was over 100 years ago. It was called slavery then. For these people, equal opportunity means a better than even chance for minorities and women to be out of work. It means an unequal chance at the welfare rolls, a head start in hopelessness, an affirmation of the opportunity America has always guaranteed us to be last hired and first fired. In a speech a year ago, the Attorney General, a native of this city, came dangerously close to saying that the government's lawyers would not obey the nation's law. Moreover, he revealed he did not know or care much about case law in civil rights. He apparently believes that court cases can be overturned at the polls, that President Reagan was elected to overturn Supreme Court decisions his supporters do not like. He seems to believe that unpopular laws do not have to be obeyed, that their violators do not require punishment. Such ignorance is dangerous in a private practitioner. In the nation's top lawyer, it is an invitation to anarchy and an appeal to the racist instincts he is pledged by solemn oath to oppose. But this assault on our civil rights is but part of the picture. It is coupled with an aggressive and all-out attack on the yet unfulfilled right of every American to be free from want and economic worry. Millions and millions of American families, both poor and working poor, are daily being herded further and further into poverty as they slip through a safety net so fragile a minnow would escape, so porous it could not contain Moby Dick. A study conducted by an official of the Nixon administration for the University of Chicago Center for the Study of Welfare Policy concluded the effects of the Reagan proposals will be to drive many low-income families deeper into poverty, while inflation continues to deplete the value of their income, and to shift significant fiscal, administrative, and political burdens onto states and localities whose budgets are already in the red. In fiscal 82 and fiscal 83, the President and the Congress cut through the safety net like a hot knife through warm butter. The fact that 1/3 of all of the families in the United States will be harmed in some fashion by these cuts is a clear reminder for the necessity of a continuing struggle to end economic discrimination in America. That disproportionate numbers of these families are black or brown is an unnecessary reminder that white supremacy remains an essential feature of the culture of mainstream America and may be permanently rooted in the American character. The President's policies in some are anti-family and they are anti-black. But as the destruction of the social safety net moves forward, as the human infrastructure of the United States begins to collapse under a deliberate design of calculated neglect, The greedy appetite of the military machine grows more voracious every day. The administration is beating our plowshares into swords, our pruning hooks into spears. The choice they've put before us in 1982 is greater than guns versus butter. It is soup kitchens and surplus cheese versus expensive airplanes and malfunctioning tanks. The $15.5 million it cost to build one Navy F-14 would build 1,000 two-bedroom homes. The $4.5 million it would have cost to create 860 miles of tunnel for the MX missile would pay the nation's mass transit bill for 1 year. The $60 million it cost to build one C-5A airplane would feed 12,000 four-person families for 1 year. And, contrary to the administration's rhetoric, this kind of spending creates fewer, not more jobs for American workers. It is capital, not labor-intensive. For every $1 billion spent on the MX missile, 17,000 people would find work. But that same billion would hire 48,000 hospital workers or 65,000 people in the building trades. It would pay for 72,000 school teachers or police officers or firefighters. It is sadly wasteful spending too. In 1980, the Army's Patriot missile exceeded its cost over the rate of inflation by 53%. That was the equivalent of $285 million, dollar for dollar, precisely the amount cut from the Women's, Infants, and Children's program. The result? 70,000 fewer pregnant women and fewer children will be assured of proper nutrition. The F-18 fighter plane cost overruns 2 years ago were $607 million, equal to the cuts made in aid to families with dependent children. That 43% increase in the cost of this airplane equals evaporated assistance to 400,000 American families. But even without comparisons to much-needed spending for human needs, the wasteful nature of this kind of spending borders on the criminal. 6 years ago, General Dynamics proposed building a new shoulder-fired attack rocket launcher for the Army. The cost of these little items would be $78 each. Today, they cost $1,000 each. 2 years ago, 1,110,000 Copperhead artillery shells, if you're interested in buying one, cost $1.2 billion. Today, half as many of these cost exactly the same amount. But the kind of aggressive militarism the country faces in 1982, the callous cutbacks in human programs, is sadly not the first time in our history that political capital has been earned at the expense of the people living on the economic edge. What is happening to us today has sadly happened more than once before. As in the Reconstruction period 100 and more years ago, the collusion between a hostile administration and a seemingly unfeeling majority seemed to doom the hopes of the American underclass. Then and now, a president desperate for power entered into an illicit arrangement, not just with the unreconstructed South, but with the national unreconstructed mentality that believed then, as it does now, that private profit and public arrogance could be pursued at the expense of the people living on the American margin. As in that earlier period is true today, the aspirations of and movement by black people began to be curtailed, not just by organized violence and barbarity, but by a series of nationally choreographed legal and extra-legal maneuvers designed to make us less than political and economic equals. The frenetic activity of the early 1960s had by the 1970s created a political counter-revolution characterized by selfishness and fear. A constituency of the comfortable, the callous, and the smug was recruited to form solid ranks against the forgotten. This massive manipulation of the American mind has made the mundane magnificent and put government in the hands of men who believe in privilege for the powerful and neglect of the powerless. Within the lifetimes of most of you here, a great deal else has changed in the United States. The economy has changed a great deal. The new economists brought to power 20 years ago by President John F. Kennedy believed that judicious manipulation of fiscal or monetary policy would automatically dissolve racism, poverty, and want. But these planners either did not or could not or would not foresee the increased corporate control of the American economy. By 1978, the top 100 U.S. companies controlled more of our total assets than the top 200 did in 1948. American capital has begun to control rather than obey the laws of supply and demand. Next, the world outside our borders has changed considerably. First, the United States began to lose what it had never owned. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Cuba, and Iran, despite our excessive ability to fire missiles and drop bombs. We lost because we aligned ourselves with the forces of reaction and oppression, and because we opposed mass movements armed with a popular political appeal, bound to defeat a superior military machine. In Ethiopia, Angola, Mozambique, the United States lost again, as the oppressive regimes we supported were overthrown. In El Salvador, Nicaragua, Namibia, and Zambia, we are sure to lose, as we continue to mislearn the lessons of our own imperial past. Almost 2 years ago today, on the 28th of October, 1980, candidate Reagan asked the voters to ask themselves if they were better off than they had been 4 years earlier when Jimmy Carter was elected President of the United States. After 20 months of the Reagan presidency, that question ought be asked again. For some Americans, the answer is an unqualified yes. If any of you here earn $100,000 or more a year, the answer is a definite yes. You're going to bring home an extra $2,000 from the Reagan tax plan, and even at $100,000 a year, an extra $2 surely can't hurt. If anybody in this audience owns an oil company, then the answer's got to be yes. You're so busy counting your windfall profits you don't have time to look for oil, so you just buy up smaller oil companies instead. If anybody here dumps poisonous waste in a river or a lake, it's smooth sailing ahead. The EPA has cut back its enforcement forces. If anyone here manufactures products that could be dangerous to the public, you're in good shape. The Consumer Product Safety Commission has dropped investigations into products linked to 60,000 injuries and 500 deaths each year. If any of you here own a factory that's dangerous to your employees, you're home free. OSHA inspections are down 17% in 1982. If anyone here expects to inherit a large estate, the answer is a definite yes. Estate taxes have almost been repealed. If anyone here owns a pharmaceutical firm, you're doing good business. Uncle Sam isn't inspecting and regulating what you sell the public as closely now as he did a year ago. And if you're a Christian academy, that's shorthand for segregated school, you're so much better off. Not only do you not have to pay taxes, you don't have to have students whose skins are dark. A new kind of social Darwinism has been foisted upon us, the survival of the richest. But despite the oppressive forces around us, the heavy weight of the self-satisfied, the cold-heartedness of the neoconservative Confederacy, a great deal of the solution to our current condition lies within our own hands. There is a great deal we can do for ourselves. Perhaps if this period in our history forces us to do on tomorrow that which we know we should have done on the day before yesterday, we may someday look back on the Reagan years with warm nostalgia. The power of the ballot box remains an undeveloped resource in all of America. Almost nowhere is this true among Americans whose skins are dark. When Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States on the 4th day of November 1980, only 6 of every eligible 10 black people was registered to vote, and only 3 of the 6 cared enough to go to the polls to cast their votes. Nowhere in the democratic world is the rate of voter registration and participation lower than it is among black young people between the ages of 18 and 25. Nowhere in the democratic world is the level of political participation lower than it is among black young people between the ages of 18 and 25. Our economic strength remains undervalued too. We abuse our purchase power. We dissipate our dollars among a class that takes and seldom gives. We persist in the belief that the other man's ice is colder, his sugar sweeter, and his medicine stronger. A people who believe that will never have ice or sugar or medicine of their own. There is, fortunately, a large number of Americans whose vision of the future does not match the view from the Oval Office. There is a sizable body of opinion in the United States which refuses to surrender yesterday's goals to the occupants of power, to the princes of privilege. But these people, our countrymen and women, young and old, of all races, creeds, and colors, mistakenly believe themselves to be impotent, unable to influence the society in which they live. 20 years ago, black young people in the southeastern United States sat down in order to stand up for their rights. They marched and they picketed and they protested against state-sanctioned segregation and brought that system crashing to its knees. In later years, another generation said no to an aggressive colonial war waged by their country in their name and put their body in the path of the war machine. Today's times require no less and, in fact, insist on more. Most immediately, this year's congressional contest ought become 435 referenda on Reaganomics, surveys on the continuation of an aggressive foreign policy. Here will come a first national opportunity to purge the Congress of the moral majoritarians. Here is a first national test of the acceptability of the arrogance of power, a first review and rejection of the radicalism of the rabid right. The scattered and fractured constituencies of progress, racial and language minorities, labor, the sexually oppressed, those for whom the American dream increasingly resembles a nightmare, must mobilize their troops and lead them once again into the streets against the barricades of apathy and indifference. Less than 20 years ago, a powerful sitting president of the United States was forced to abandon plans for re-election as an angry nation shouted no to his plans for war financed at the expense of America's poor. That shout should be heard again throughout this country, at every ballot box, at every forum, at every street corner where the people gather and the people meet. To accommodation with apartheid, we must say no. To the reversal of racial equality, we must say no. To the elimination of those programs which sustain life, we must say no. To those who foul our air and water, we must say no. To the planners of nuclear holocaust, we must say no. To $1,000 China place settings, to ketchup on the school lunch menu, we must say no. We must most importantly say no to our self-imposed political impotence, to our seeming inability to help finance our own forward progress. You know, it is nothing short of a national scandal that while in 1979 and 1980, America's only domestic terrorist organization, the 117-year-old Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, experienced a 25% increase in membership in each of those years, that progressive organizations fighting for the forward movement of minority peoples did not experience a similar increase in strength and membership and growth. Now, doesn't it make ordinary common sense that if the people who are dedicated to your death and destruction are growing in strength and power, that you ought to do the same? Ladies and gentlemen, I am involved with an organization called Klan Watch, which monitors and studies the Ku Klux Klan. And I can report to you now from this platform today for the first time anywhere, do you believe that? That the reason why members of the KKK wear these tall pointed conical hats is to make up for physical imperfections in other parts of their bodies. About About 3/4 of a century ago, the late scholar W.E.B. Du Bois put down on paper an antidote to the kind of violence he saw about him then and we see about us today. It remains good today. He said then, "I believe in God who made of one blood all the races that dwell on the earth. I believe we all, black, brown, and white, are brothers, varying through time and opportunity, in form and gift and feature, but differing in no essential particular, alike in soul and in the possibility of infinite development. I believe in service, humble, reverent service, from the blackening of boots to the whitening of souls. For work is heaven, idleness hell, and wages the well done of the master that summoned all them that labor and are heavy laden, making no distinction between the black sweating cotton hands of Georgia and the first families of Virginia, since all distinction not based on deed is devilish and not divine. I believe in the Prince of Peace, white and stronger, but foreshadows the death of their strength. I believe cursed by color, thinking, hoping, dreaming, working as we will."
Time for a couple of questions. Come.
The question is, how do I feel about President Reagan's quote that he bleeds for the... And obviously he does. I'm sure that he probably feels badly about it and persists in denying that he is in any way responsible for it. I think he just literally does not understand what it is to be living in a government headed by Ronald Reagan. I can't imagine that if he did understand that he would be doing the things he does. I think he simply hasn't really thought it through. But, well, he just hadn't thought it through.
There any other questions?
The question asks, if you let me paraphrase it, is it fair to place blame every 4 years on the person who's in office, and isn't it that there's something larger and greater at work here and responsible here? Is that a fair paraphrase of the question? Well, I think you're right that there is something larger and greater, but let me say something about the president right now. He is the president right now, and he has done certain acts, and the members of the Congress have acquiesced in those acts, and those acts have had a harmful effect on thousands and thousands and thousands, if not millions, of people who live in the United States. Immediately, the only opportunity we have at striking back comes in the first week in November, when all of the members of the House of Representatives and a third of the members of the United States Senate come before the people for review. And the people have the opportunity then to do one of three things: to say, yes, I like what they've been doing and I want them to keep on with it. No, I don't like what they've been doing and I'm going to take them out of office and put someone else in their place. Or to do what unfortunately most people do, which is say, well, I'm not in it, it's not really up to me, nothing I can do, I can't have any effect on it. If enough people do the third thing, then the present course we're on is going to continue. But yes, you are right, there is a larger system at work here, which is ultimately responsible. Unfortunately, it's not as easily attackable as the political candidate who comes before you. But there is a larger system. It is called capitalism, capitalism. It is a larger system which ultimately bears the responsibility for the condition we are in. And I don't want to dodge talking about it, but I do want to urge people to strike an immediate blow against the phenomenon called Reaganomics, which is the rawest example of capitalism, unleashed capitalism, that we've seen in this country in 45 to 50 years. If you don't take the opportunity to strike back at it in the first week in November, then it's going to be much more difficult to do so in the years and years to come. There's a big debate, among people who consider themselves on the left Should I get involved in this electoral political system, or should I spend my time organizing people at the grassroots level for some other purposes? Why does it have to be this choice? Why can't both things be done? Why can't the effective and efficiently organized person do both? This is an enormous opportunity to choose who's going to help run the country over the next several years. And if you don't take it, not to choose is to choose. Because if people who believe that the country ought to be run in a democratic fashion with a small d, if they absent themselves from the process where the decision is being made about who it's going to be, they're in effect voting for the other side. So it's a dangerous, dangerous mistake to stay away from this process. You're only helping the people on the other side. The question is, what is my opinion of Jesse Jackson's boycott plan and whether or not I'm associated with it? I'm not associated with it in any kind of formal way, but I'm very supportive of it. It is a modern extension of a very, very old idea. You know, black people individually in the United States are not at all a wealthy people. We have a lower income than most people, a lower educational level, and therefore less of a chance of making a higher income. But collectively, we are an extremely wealthy people. We spend $142 billion a year. And we spend it, we're always complaining, I know, that we don't have enough money to spend on this or that. I never have enough money to spend on this or that. But I'll tell you how much money we spent on some things last year. I luckily have it written down right here at my fingertips. Here we go. A year ago, black people in the United States spent $15 million on barbecue sauce. We spent $62 million on hair conditioners. We spent $79 million on chewing gum. We spent $132 million on rice, $271 million on potato chips, and $360 million on wine and champagne. Now, if we could begin, as Reverend Jackson suggests, to direct that spending, then it could resound to the greater benefit. He threatened to boycott the Coca-Cola Company, and from the Coca-Cola Company won some concessions, which I think, when implemented, are going to help a fairly broad range of people. And now he's in a struggle with the Anheuser-Busch Corporation, the makers of Budweiser beer, and is having difficulty with them. But I think he's on the right track, and I hope he prevails.
Okay. Last question.
The question is, if you didn't hear, is there any question in my mind as to whether or not the ultimate solution to the problem black people have rests in creating a self-sufficient economy? Is that a fair paraphrase of your question? I don't think that is the absolute ultimate solution to our problem. James Baldwin said it much better than I. Who wants to integrate into a burning house? I don't want to have a parallel black setup to the present setup, but would rather have either a parallel setup of a more humane system and a democratic system, with a small d. I think what you're talking about is a major part of the solution, but don't by any means think it that alone. I would hate just to be a mirror image of what I now see, to have my own version of what I now see, and would rather have a different version of what I now see. Thank you all very much.